February 1st, 1960. Manchester, New Hampshire. On the frigid, snow-covered sideways and streets of northern New England is the town of Manchester, New Hampshire, a large city nestled within the greater New England that has a rich history ever since its founding. However, in the winter of 1960, a murder would kickstart a possible mystery that would stretch over 4 years and claim the lives of 2 more women in the greater Manchester area. Today, on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore another true crime mystery that connects 3 women, and that many things are all also connected together. Today, this is the murder of Sandra Valade. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you were listening to this show on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I publish a new episode, so you never miss one. You're right there to jump right on it when I post a new episode. If you're listening to this on YouTube, I appreciate you first off, but if you like to comment, subscribe to my content, I appreciate it. It helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, today on the show, we are doubling down on the true crime from last week and now this week. And today on the show, albeit we have a shorter unsolved mystery, perhaps there are not as many moving pieces as last week, but it is still perplexing and very strange because we don't have the answers. We have some, but we also have plenty of unanswered questions to go along with it. Now, on today's episode, we are diving into the murder of Sandra Valade, and I hope I am pronouncing that right. I think it's also Valade. So I'm going to say Valade, and I'm going to hope that's right, and how Sandra's murder actually connects with 2 other murders, one being the murder of Pamela Mason, and the other being the suspicious death of Rena Paquette, all seemingly linked together. And with some of our questions being answered and some remaining unknown, this provides a very interesting backdrop to the story that I'm about to tell you. Now, I originally got tracked onto this case by seeing it in a Wendigoon video. If you've never heard of Wendigoon, I highly suggest you check him out. He's amazing. I love his content. And when I saw this, it piqued my interest. Of course, me being based in the New England area, I was surprised that I had not heard of this case, as very often I find myself researching and exploring some of the unsolved crimes throughout New England. And when looking for weekly topics, and maybe a little bit of a side note here, I kind of find myself looking into these cold cases and these New England-based cold cases and kind of finding out that there's very little available information to the public when it comes to some of these more obscure unsolved homicides, some of which are actually in a relative distance away from me. However, much information is either very limited out there on the internet or seemingly non-existent entirely, and I find that very strange to me. Now, I know it is not up to me or up to police to release every little bit of information to the public, but it makes me curious. Why wouldn't you release what you know to the public or ask for more leads when it comes to these cold cases? But what do I know? I just merely research this and put content out on the internet for you all to enjoy it. However, I digress, and that is me just venting in the grand scheme of things. But with that all being said, let's get back to today's topic. Now, how today's episode is going to work is that we are first going to explore where this story takes place, what we know about Sandra Valade, her murder, and the connections between her murder, the murder of Pamela Mason, and the suspicious death of Rena Paquette, and then talk about what we know in this case, and the suspect/killer, and these unanswered questions that we still have after this case has now sat after all of these years. Manchester, New Hampshire is the largest city within the state of New Hampshire, and it sits towards the southeast part of the state. It is in close proximity to other noteworthy New England cities like Boston and Portland, Maine. Manchester has seen its fair share of changes throughout history and has taken on many different names throughout its conception to present day. Originally home of the Pennacook tribe of Native Americans, the first iteration of Manchester was actually known as Old Harry's Town when it was first settled in 1722. From there, it would change names for the first time, becoming Tingstown in 1735, named after Captain William Ting, and the land was granted to the men of Captain Ting by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Then in 1751, it would change names again, shocker, and it would change names to Dairyfield. Now, in the years that followed, it would start to develop industries such as textiles and manufacturing, and then in 1810 is when it would adopt the name Manchester by Samuel Blodgett, who saw the city as becoming, and I quote, the Manchester of America. As it turns out, Blodgett helped construct the canals currently sitting at Amoskeag Falls, or at the time at Amoskeag Falls, that helped people travel to Boston, and Blodgett was inspired by the large canals present in Manchester, England, and that is kind of where he took his inspiration from, and then obviously textiles helping the town become a little bit of a manufacturing hub, and this kind of inspired him to rename it to Manchester, him looking at it as the, Manchester of America. Now, while the textile industry flourished in Manchester with the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company producing and milling cotton, the city's economy during this time actually really depended on the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company to do well. However, during the 1930s, the Industrial Revolution hit hard, and it hit Amoskeag Manufacturing Company even harder. And on top of that, a workers' strike due to labor conditions in 1922 certainly did not do them any favors. In 1935, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company would declare bankruptcy, and Manchester would be hit hard economically from this, and as the Industrial Revolution would slowly be changing the city, people weren't doing well financially. In the slow burn of this process of switching over from its textile mill past to a manufacturing future was easier said than done. In 1960, these would be very, very present issues, and these would further be made worse when the threat of young women going missing would become a very present reality when Sandra Valade would never return home. Sandra Valade would be born on July 12, 1941. Now, while we might not know much about her childhood, we can reasonably assume, like many during this time while living in Manchester, it was more than likely life was not financially easy. However, that would not stop Sandra from becoming an honor grad at Central High School, and upon graduating, she was working as a secretary at a factory within Manchester. Sandra stayed involved in her community as well, and would often attend swim classes at the local YMCA. On February 1st, 1960, it was a particularly cold day within Manchester, and if you were unfamiliar with how cold it can get up here in the Northeast, it is pretty regular for winter temps to stay somewhere in the teens to freezing or even slightly above freezing. Snow can be extreme at times, and while southern parts of New Hampshire don't get as much snow as they used to, it still gets very, very cold. Now, 1960 was no exception to the cold. Overall, the 1960s were one of the snowier decades on record for New England, and just a few weeks after this, in early March of 1960, a large nor'easter would move through New England, dropping as much as 20 inches of snow in the southern portions of New Hampshire. So needless to say, the weather is not ideal in the winter, and if you are not dressed or prepared for it, it can certainly get bad in a hurry for someone lost in the elements and the cold. Now, Sandra would leave her job at around 4:30 p.m. that evening, and she would travel to the YMCA for swim classes. Afterwards, she would then go back home. However, she would never arrive home that night from the YMCA. What we do know is that Sandra boarded a bus from the YMCA, and that bus would drop her off at a bus stop about a mile from her home between 9:15 to 9:30 p.m. that night. Now, it is within this mile window of being in between the bus stop and her home is when she would go missing. When Sandra did not come home, it would send alarm bells ringing in the minds of her parents, who knew that not coming home was completely unlike Sandra. When she would not come home that night, her parents would contact the New Hampshire police, and they would start their search and investigation. The New Hampshire police would alert neighboring states, deploy the National Guard to assist in the search, and volunteer groups all started scouring Manchester for Sandra. Just a few days after Sandra's disappearance, a discovery would be made of some of Sandra's belongings being found in a 15-foot deep wide canal that led to a nearby pond around the Manchester area. Within that canal was one of her winter boots, her wallet, and her red purse. At this point, the odds of finding Sandra alive probably were not high, as the discovery of those belongings was not a good sign. However, it would get worse, as investigators would later discover Sandra's coat that was discarded in a snowbank, and bloodstains were found in the snow surrounding the winter coat. Investigators wanted to find Sandra, and they thought that she could have been murdered and disposed of in the same pond that where her purse, wallet, and boot were found in the canal right next to it. Now, police, thinking that she could have been disposed in this same pond, they even went to the length of draining this pond, but they didn't have any luck. However, 9 days later, on February 10th, the remains of Sandra Valade would be found in a snowbank in the town of Derry, New Hampshire, not far at all from Manchester. Upon investigation of Sandra's body, it was clear that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, stabbed, and shot 4 times. A gruesome and sad end, to say the least. Upon further investigation, it was determined that Sandra was shot with a .22 caliber gun, and that it was that gun that caused her death. After the discovery of Sandra's body, this now sent law enforcement on a different kind of search, one in which they needed to figure out who could be responsible, and with basically no witnesses to the night she disappeared, they went off what they did know, the gun and the knife. They searched nearby waterways to try and find any discarded weapons that could have been dumped by the killer, as well as interrogating anyone within the Manchester area if they owned a .22 caliber gun. The police had very little to go on, and the leads and suspects were very few and far between. While some interrogations and suspects appeared in these initial 2 years following the murder, ultimately no one could be charged at the time, and they had very little evidence tying anyone to the crime, and unfortunately this is where the case would go cold for quite some time. However, fast forward to 1964, another young girl would be murdered, and the similarities between her case and Sandra's made the police and the surrounding communities think they could be related and connected. That girl's name was Pamela Mason. Pamela Mason was a 14-year-old girl living in Manchester and attending school at West High School there in the city. Now, as a way to make a few extra bucks for herself while going to school, Pamela would often babysit in her free time and would be kind of known and trusted in the area as a reliable babysitter. In an effort to expand her reach, Pamela would place ads in a local laundromat advertising her services as a babysitter. Now, on this ad would be the Mason family phone number. On January 13th, 1964, a man called the Mason residence asking for Pamela and her services babysitting. Now, originally, this man who had called had given his address and would wait to hear back, as the only people home at the time he called originally were Pamela's parents. Now, Pamela's mother replied that the only way that she would feel comfortable with Pamela getting picked up to this babysitting job from this man would be that if his wife came with him. Now, supposedly on the phone, the man agreed, and later on in the night, the man arrived at the Mason home and picked up Pamela. However, once Pamela got picked up, she would never come back home that night. Pamela would be reported missing to the police, and as it turns out, the address given by this mysterious man over the phone to Pamela's mother was not possibly his real address. As backtracking to the address he mentioned over the phone, it turns out that this address was actually the home of a very elderly couple, which means they couldn't possibly be needing a babysitter, and this led police to knowing that Pamela was kidnapped, and this man had used a fake address to lure Pamela out. Now, at the time, this was eerily reminiscent of 4 years prior with Sandra Valade, and many people within the Manchester area echoed those feelings. 8 days after disappearing that night, a truck driver would discover Pamela's school bag and belongings discarded along a stretch of Interstate 93 near Manchester. Upon investigating the belongings scattered on the side of the highway, he would discover Pamela's body nearby as well. Pamela's cause of death would be determined to be that she was shot and killed with a .22 caliber gun. Now, the similarities between the cases now after the fact, Pamela's body being discovered, were even more apparent. However, at the time, there was no evidence to connect the two murders to one suspect, besides suspicion, and kind of that they were similar, and the additional note of Pamela's body being found only 2 miles away from where Sandra's body would be found in 1960. Now, while investigators started to think that maybe these cases were connected, again, there was no evidence other than kind of circumstantial evidence to connect them together. In the instance of Pamela's case, in the very early portions of the investigation, the leads were very hard to come by. And it was the same way in Sandra's case. Leads were few and far between, and it was just very tough sledding in terms of trying to figure out who murdered Pamela. And then the ideas of these two crimes being connected, and then the public thinking, hey, is there somebody out there that is abducting our daughters off the street? It was a very present fear and a very present reality, and something that was probably extremely scary for the parents in Manchester during this time period. Now, during said time period of the early investigations into Pamela's murder, this is where another name would enter the fray, and that name would be of a woman named Rena Paquette. Rena Paquette was someone who kind of inserted herself within the investigation of Pamela's murder. Paquette was convinced that the two murders, Pamela and Sandra, were connected. Sure, the police had these hunches as well. However, it was Paquette who came forward and said to the police that she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, who killed Pamela, and that the person who killed Pamela was the same person who killed Sandra 4 years prior. A few weeks after the murder of Pamela, on February 3rd, 1964, this story would take another perplexing twist that just adds more to this mystery. On that morning, the members of the Paquette family would awake and not be able to find Rena anywhere in the house. Rena's son, Danny, would look around the house to much of no avail and thought that she must be somewhere, but wasn't sure where. This was abnormal, as it was not very warm outside. It was another cold New England winter, so the idea of her being outside in the early morning in February seemed unlikely. However, that is the only place she could be after a search of the Paquette home ended with no sight of Rena. After gathering other members of the family, Danny and the others started looking around the Paquette family property, and on this Paquette family property, it was rather large, and it contained a farm and a barn. Now, after searching for a minute, Danny and the other members of the Paquette family noticed smoke emitting from an area that contained their barn. Now, when going to investigate the smoke, Danny and the others noticed the barn was engulfed with flames and burning to the ground. When the ashes and flames subsided from the barn, it was discovered that Rena, in fact, was inside of the barn, discovered in the pigsty, and much of her body was badly burned. Now, when police arrived, they determined initially that the cause of death was suicide. But as I usually say, when it comes to quote-unquote suicides that are suspicious, that means is bullshit. The police theorized that the reason she committed suicide like this was because of the added stress she had put onto her plate trying to be involved in the cases of Pamela Mason and Sandra Valade. Now, the police also added that she felt personally distraught still by the assassination of JFK in November of the previous year, and the combination between these events, investigating the Mason case and the Valade case, and then being still distraught about the JFK assassination, seemingly led her to a distraught mental state where she would take her own life. However, if you ask me, that seems like a fucking stretch for sure. But, of course, we'll kind of come back to this here in a little bit. But overall, it kind of makes you ask the question, did what Rena Paquette say about knowing the killer of Pamela Mason hold some merit? And is that why maybe Paquette was murdered? Because we all know she didn't burn the barn down in a strange act of suicide. Like, come on, we all ain't that stupid. It is an interesting thought that maybe somebody had killed Paquette to cover it up because she knew too much. Now, this has led to some internet sleuths to speculate that maybe this is evidence of a much larger cover-up at play with the murders of Sandra, Pamela, and the suspicious death of Rena Paquette, all being wrapped together in one. Now, while the Rena Paquette suspicious death case would be taking shape, police would be still investigating the case against Pamela Mason. Knowing that she had been killed by a .22 caliber gun, the police again started combing the greater Manchester area for anyone who owned a .22 caliber weapon and questioning them. This would lead them to multiple different directions. However, another name that appeared that they had seen before would come into play. And now this same name also appeared in Sandra's case 4 years earlier. And the name of this man would be Edward Coolidge. Coolidge worked as a delivery driver and admitted to the police that he actually had his car stuck on the highway during the time Pamela was killed. However, a couple of bystanders would confirm that Coolidge was stuck on I-93 and that they helped him free his vehicle. However, that time did not match with the murder of Pamela, and the times were different. Coolidge's alibi was weak, and Coolidge happened to own a .22 caliber rifle. Now, a shaky alibi in the idea that he owned a .22 caliber rifle would be enough to get a search warrant. Police would search Coolidge's vehicle and his home and seize the rifle and test his car for gunpowder residue. Ballistics were done on Coolidge's rifle, and they came to an exact match for the ballistics found on the bullet that killed Pamela Mason. On February 19, 1964, Edward Coolidge would be arrested and charged with murder. From this point on, the trial of Edward Coolidge would involve making a variety of statements, saying that other people could vouch for his whereabouts that night. However, when those four men were questioned about being able to testify where he was that night, those four men said that they had not seen Coolidge the night of Pamela's murder. Similar sentiment was echoed by witnesses who said that Coolidge had given 3 different stories as to what happened and where he was the night of Pamela's murder. Ultimately, through these testimonies of not having a definitive location on Coolidge that night, coupled with the ballistic test confirming his weapon was the one used to kill Pamela, Coolidge was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. However, this is not where the story of Edward Coolidge would stop. In 1971, Coolidge's legal team would seek to have his conviction reviewed and appealed. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, in fact, and through this review, it was learned that the search warrant that was executed on Coolidge's vehicle was not approved by a neutral third party, as the person who signed the search warrant would later become the prosecutor for the state of New Hampshire in the case. So because of this appeal made by Coolidge's attorney, he was tried again, and even though he was found guilty again, his sentence was reduced to 25 years. However, this is kind of where the stories stop for the most part. As it turns out, Rena Paquette's body would be exhumed in 1991, and the official cause of death would be changed from suicide to undetermined, which pretty much confirmed what we already knew, that she was murdered. And you kind of don't want to admit she was murdered, and that she definitely didn't kill herself. However, what it does leave us with is the unanswered questions behind the death of Sandra Valade and Rena Paquette, as Coolidge was not convicted of any crimes affiliated with those 2 women's murders. Now, is it possible that Coolidge was responsible for all 3 murders? Perhaps Coolidge had an accomplice that committed the killing of Paquette since she knew too much? Who knows? I am merely speculating. Now, the story has gotten some spotlight within true crime circles, with the story appearing on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries for actually something completely different. You see, in 1985, Danny Paquette, Rena Paquette's son, would be found shot to death near his home. Now, during this time, the family thought that Danny was murdered because he knew something about the murders of his mother, Rena, and Sandra's murder, and that he knew too much. Now, authorities did not believe this theory. However, it was enough to get the attention of Unsolved Mysteries and the attention of the general public to try and find Danny's killer, and possibly the killer of the women, by having the story appear on Unsolved Mysteries. However, it turns out Danny's mystery was solved when in fact it was not related to his mom's death or Sandra's, as Danny would end up being murdered by a man named Eric Winhurst, a friend of Danny's stepdaughter. Now, while that murder is solved, it unfortunately brings us back to the idea of Sandra and Rena. Both of their cases remain unsolved to this day. But with this being said, and kind of being the end of our story, let's discuss theories. Now, the first theory being that this was Edward Coolidge, that Coolidge committed all 3 murders, and we unfortunately don't have enough evidence to prove all 3 of the killings, and he will most likely take the knowledge of these crimes to the grave with him. He will not confess to them. Obviously, he was not convicted of the murder of Sandra. He was not found guilty of anything else other than the murder of Pamela Mason. So if Coolidge did in fact commit the murder of Sandra and then commit the murder of Rena Paquette because she knew too much, we might not ever know. Now, the second theory I have, and there's really only two theories to this because I'm going to give you my personal opinion here in a second, is that maybe Coolidge was in fact responsible for the murder of Pamela, and he killed Rena because she knew he did it, and she was obviously going around town saying that Coolidge was the killer. And perhaps in this instance, if you'd like to go this route, Coolidge in fact did not kill Sandra and merely read about her case and thought that maybe if disposed of Pamela the same way the killer did of Sandra, he could get away with it, and maybe just think that they could be lumped together and he could get away scot-free. However, this theory I'm kind of skeptical of. I think that there's just too many connections for Coolidge to not be the killer of all three of the girls. Now, if you go back to Sandra's case, where she was found, obviously she was picked up off the side of the road in between the bus stop and her house. Obviously, cause of death was being shot by a .22 caliber gun, and obviously seemingly disposed of, found in a nearby snowbank. You go to Pamela Mason's case, her body was discarded off the side of the road, killed with a .22 caliber gun. Ages are very similar. You're in that kind of teenager to 18-year-old young adult phase. That part matches up. So you have a consistent age demographic, you have a consistent MO with causes of death, and obviously Rena kind of being this wild card of, obviously she was going around town saying that she knew that it was Coolidge who had killed Sandra and had killed Pamela, and obviously to me it seems like he knew, or word got around that Rena was saying that he had killed Pamela and Sandra, and obviously through the eyes of Coolidge, Rena had to be dealt with. Whether or not he killed Rena himself, I don't know. I am merely speculating. These are my own opinions. Maybe that's going to always remain unsolved. But it seems more than likely to me that Coolidge killed Sandra back in 1960. Obviously got away with it. Tried to do it again in 1964 with Pamela. Was caught. But while Rena was going around saying these things that he killed Sandra, that he killed Pamela, this is when he's like, hey, I can't get caught. I need to get rid of Rena. And then ultimately they were still investigating Pamela's murder, and he was found and convicted for his crime. Now, unfortunately, he did not spend life in prison like he should have, basically due to a legal technicality. It still kind of raises interesting questions of whether or not Edward Coolidge was responsible for the murders of all three women. It's a very interesting true crime case that I think you almost get 33% of the case solved, and then you're kind of left with nothing. Because you still have questions. You don't know if Coolidge committed the other murders. You think he did, but there's no evidence really to tie him to whether or not he was there the night Sandra Valade was murdered, or the time when the Paquette family barn was lit on fire while Rena was inside the barn. Now, it's very clear to me that Rena did not kill herself by lighting the barn on fire, and it seems more likely to me that Coolidge was responsible for all three killings. Convicted on the killing of Pamela Mason, obviously, since there was no evidence pinning him to the other two murders. Obviously, he was not going to confess to the other two. He was going to serve his 25 because of the legal technicality, get off, and I think, unfortunately, take the answers of Sandra's killing and Rena Paquette's killing to the grave with him. Now, I did not see anything in my research, and obviously research for this was kind of limited just due to the scale of this crime. It is not one that has gotten a tremendous amount of spotlight within true crime communities, but from what I could find, there's nothing saying whether or not Edward Coolidge was still alive. Maybe I have to do some deeper diving into that, and I probably will, but I could not see anything currently on whether or not Coolidge is still alive. But again, I do unfortunately think that he will take the true story of what happened to Sandra Valade. Obviously, Pamela Mason, we know he committed that murder. And the story of Rena Paquette, he will most likely take all of those stories to the grave with him. And unfortunately, we will not have justice for those two women, Sandra Valade or Rena Paquette. But overall, I think this is a very fascinating true crime case that's a little bit different than ones I've covered before. And obviously, when I found this and I heard about its proximity to kind of New England, where I am, I knew I had to cover it. And obviously, I know how much you all love true crime stories, so that was a big motivator for me to cover it for this week's episode. But with that being said, I hope you appreciated this week's episode over the murder of Sandra Valade, and obviously we covered the murder of Pamela Mason, and the murder, I'm calling it a murder, of Rena Paquette. But with that all being said, I hope you really enjoyed this episode, doubling down on true crime, obviously, from last week to this week. I know you guys love it so much, so I want to double down on it now, being the beginning of Season 3, and I really hope to have you all be along the ride with me for this Season 3. I appreciate the support up to this point, and it goes without saying, I just appreciate everything. I love it when people come up to me and talk about the show, and I love it. But I do this all for you. I obviously enjoy it, but I know all of you appreciate these stories being told and appreciate these content, and I appreciate you. But with that all being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode on the murder of Sandra Valade, the murder of Pamela Mason, and the murder of Rena Paquette. And I hope you all enjoyed it. And that's going to do it for me, and I will see you all on the next one.